afternoon or good morning, wherever you're listening in the world. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about today's conversation. We don't have any hosts. This is co-hosting a genuine fireside chat.
Without fire.
Without fire, with my good friend, although maybe some fireworks, with my long-term friend, really, Paul Maxin. Paul can tell you a little bit about his history in a minute. Anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Bill Boorman. I'm an advisor to Real Links and other startups. I work with technology companies, been very heavily involved around the referral and the internal mobility space. So this is really a pet topic of mine I get very excited about. And when I want advice and some help, there's a few people in the industry I always reach out to. And my guest, when they're not available, I managed to get hold of my guest today, who's my old friend, the distinguished recruitment commentator and global head of talent acquisition, Mr. Paul Maxin. So, Paul, perhaps you'd like to.
What an intro, Bill. Thank you very much. And hat tip to you. I've bought a hat, but I won't wear it throughout our conversation because that's your domain. I tend to wear them socially. But Bill, we've known each other for more than 40 years, which dates us a bit. I've known Bill since I was at school, and he's known me since he was at school as well. Career-wise, though, we've worked together a fair amount. My career has encompassed both large and fast-growing organisations. I was at PwC, Unilever, and then internal at the Financial Conduct Authority. And then for the last 4 to 5 years, I've been kind of ploughing my own furrow and had some a global gig at Zalando, the fashion platform based in Berlin, commuting on Ryanair twice a week for a year, and which was the toughest part of the gig. And for the last 2 and a bit years, until February, till just before COVID struck, but not because of COVID, I had a great 2.5 years with Publicis Sapient, which is the digital transformation consulting arm of the Publicis Group, which in itself is one of the world's largest holding companies, French. I've done a lot of traveling through worked with a lot of different cultures, and I'm now also, like Bill, an advisor to Real Links as well. So it's great to be connected again. And likewise, I've got I think you and I, perhaps second to D and I, internal mobility is a key component of talent and talent acquisition strategy, and one which is either often overlooked or indeed misunderstood.
It's kind of my first thing, really, to ask you about, Paul, see your opinion and give my opinion a little bit. Yeah. We're seeing more internal mobility being a talent acquisition topic, whereas in the past it's been very much kind of an HR driven initiative, or something that kind of happens but isn't particularly structured. How much is this increasingly falling in talent acquisition? What difference does that make in internal mobility?
Yeah, I mean, arguably you can say that the best people to select talent for roles, be that internal or external, are the talent acquisition specialists, the recruitment partners. But I actually think there's a connection between talent and talent acquisition. We know that there have been some studies that good internal mobility increases engagement by 30%. I think there was a Bursin paper that said something like that. And it also in the COVID world, or COVID and post-COVID world, I think there's going to be something around internal mobility increasing or enabling rather organizational resilience. And the reason why I think talent acquisition will now sort of be more involved is, external, the whole external marketplace for talent has probably been sort of partly turned on its head during the course of the pandemic. And what organizations should know is that the skill sets and talents that they have is the best way to fill roles. And the roles that companies or organizations will need to fill as we come out of the pandemic into 2021 may well be different roles from the roles they had and were posting externally before going into the pandemic.
Yeah, so just to ask you a question on that, Paul, that's kind of a NSS, no Sherlock type statement. It would be easier, it would be more effective, it would be better to hire people from your own talent pool who you already know, people who already work for you. So why haven't we seen this as a bigger thing? Because it's kind of like, it makes sense, because no one is going to argue too much with the statement that the best talent probably already works for you. So why don't we see this being much more predominant in hiring strategy?
I think that often it is in a hiring strategy, but it's the execution of that strategy that often fails. There have been barriers to internal mobility in no particular order. They can be line managers who, in inverted commas, don't want to lose their best talent, want to hold on to them. Joe or Joanna blogs is my kind of person. I know them. I've developed them. I don't want to lose them. Without
you tend to, if you want to take people, you tend to be wanting to take the best people out of another department.
Indeed. So the internal market for talent becomes an internal competition, oftentimes amongst line managers for talent, and not to lose their own. And that's a fundamentally different line of thinking to recognizing that there is actually an intra-supply of talent, and that people within organizations are all sort of are passive job seekers. And a lot of that is, so why it doesn't work is because internal mobility is often not embedded into the culture. And again, looking at other reports, on average, 15 or 16% of roles may be filled internally, but actually only gets about 4% of the budgeted dollar.
I'd just kind of like to ask you a question on that one, Paul, on that piece of data, because this is something that I think about quite a lot.
Yeah.
Which is particularly as to who internal mobility is for, right? It is the first point. I think that when we talk about 14% of roles being filled internally, this is a guesstimate. I haven't asked you to prepare anything or have any real data, so I won't accuse you of fake news or anything like that. But when we're talking 14% of roles are filled internally, how many of those roles do you feel are being led by the company pushing that move? Typically in a vertical promotion, the career ladders that we've seen, you worked in multinational corporations, very reasonably rigid. You do your 2 years, you do a course. It's kind of like being in prison. You keep your nose clean, you get a reward, you get promoted. And it's kind of rinse and repeat every 2 or 3 years. So how much of that 14% internal mobility do you think is driven and planned? And how much of it do you think is people putting their hand up and saying, hey, I want to do something different?
It's a bit of both. I don't have the data, as you're right. It's not going to give you any fake news to give you the exact figures. But I think you've got two sides to that. You've got talent management, and talent acquisition. Now, talent management is often focused on purely on what an organisation considers the high potential people, which is, is often less than, hang on, let me finish. Is often sort of less than 14% of the
14%.
Sorry,
14% is yeah.
Yeah, 1/4 of the total workforce. So if you focus the attention on those high potentials, then the high potentials are the ones that are pushed into that upwardly mobile career path. But that's only focusing on a small number of the population within an organisation. It's not necessarily focusing on the best match for the right people in the right roles, and it's not necessarily focusing on what skills you need to go into those roles. So I think, unless you correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, you're also sort of looking very much at a hierarchy in that, and that those people are identified and pushed into roles, often as part of their promotion. Whereas I think you and I know that, or believe that lateral movement is as important as vertical movement in that respect. And that is because
it's definitely something I've seen. I think the other alarm bell that's kind of why you're saying that, I've got this buzzer going off in my head, which is asking the diversity and inclusion in the old boys club type question of, it's almost like you don't have necessarily lots of organisations a particularly diverse funnel for a start, the people who get through the process, and then once you're in the process, that high performance funnel of who's getting marked out and moved on becomes even less diverse if we look at the data within that.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And when it comes to having
it's hard enough to get a job.
Real discussions about individuals' potential. It's often senior people having those discussions without actually the input of what those people's potential is. And then, notwithstanding that, sometimes in global organisations, and I think this is what you're alluding to, it's not necessarily what you know, what you can do, it's who you know. And you'll
it's the old boys. It's the old boys. The old being old boys from the same school.
The fastest path to promotion or getting your dream job or moving within the organisation is to hold on to the coattails of somebody else's who got to where they did by doing exactly the same. And
it's the political players who move through organisations rather than necessarily performers in organisations.
Exactly that, and it doesn't necessarily follow. There's very little transparency in that, and sometimes that's put down to talent management, but you're only managing a few people. And during the course of the 2 years that he or she has been identified to move into a new role, well, the world's moved on, so that's another reason why you can get the wrong people in the wrong jobs by the, as you described it, the old boys network. I mean, we're part of an old boys network as well, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. It hasn't yet got me a gig, but we'll see. You never know. But I think that's one of the alarm bells I have. Now, the other point, I obviously jumped in on that, but when we're talking about internal mobility and barriers, the other big thing that I see is visibility of opportunity.
Yeah.
I've worked with organisations where the expectation has been that employees are going to be religiously signed up for the career site and job alerts and all this kind of thing. And I think the reality, when we looked at the numbers, was it was about 2% of a 3,000 person company who actually did ever visit the career site beyond the day when they were looking for a job.
Yeah.
It wasn't something they were following. And as a result, it's kind of like in the old days, if you worked in a factory, you'd pin a job up on the notice board.
More people saw that job on the notice board than actually on a sort of a company's intranet.
More people saw it than on the internet, but it still relied on you looking at the notice board. There was no push aspect.
No push notification,
Right. And equally, when we look at data and we look at talent, the policy was kind of show that job to everyone who will look at it, rather than maybe doing it in a targeted way around skills or some more specific matching behind it.
Well, that's right. The and where there is supposed, or companies think they've got internal mobility, exactly as you said, they've got an internal online job board, effectively, which only 2 or 3% of people look at, usually because they're not liking what they're doing at the moment. And you miss out on the other 97%. You've got to proactively apply on it, and it's there's very little visibility of that, and those job boards, as you rightly say, don't take into account the kind of push notification in terms of what people want. So the world's moved on. There isn't typically easy access to opportunities. And I think,
I mean, definitely the best organisation I've ever seen and the best leader I've come across, yourself except present company accepted or omitted from this list, was Ari Ball. Ari ran Sodexo in the US. I was very involved in looking at what Sodexo were doing 7 or 8 years ago. In the advent of social media, they were kind of the leaders in things like alumni hiring and other areas. And one of the big areas I know they developed and pushed was internal mobility. And there was 3 things that they did, which has kind of become my mantra into my thinking when we talk about internal mobility. The first one was putting it in talent acquisition and saying, right, if talent acquisition team identify the best talent, then they should be the people identifying the best talent. If you're the best at roles, at things like employer brand, at messaging, as you should be, otherwise we may be in the wrong job, then we should be the best people to handle the internal piece of that. The second thing was that they removed all the permissions so that people could be notified of a job. The third thing was they could set their status. So every employee had a profile and they could say almost traffic lights, red, amber, yellow. I love that traffic light systems in things for simplicity. Red meaning don't talk to me about a job at the moment. Yellow going, I'm thinking about stuff. You could show me stuff, but I'm not in any rush. Green was kind of fill your boots, full guns ahead. I'm interested in something. So that thinking was important. Now, the other battle that I remember Ari describing in detail, and I think it was a battle, was within organizations, getting people to understand skill sets when perhaps you had different niches within an organization. So typically someone like Sodexo, I know the examples we looked at in particular, because it was a project Ari was working on, was for catering managers, unit heads, basically unit. They're an external contract catering company, one of the biggest in the world. So I think the other point, the thing that's important to me with that is when we're talking about that mobility, one of the blocks was people saying, oh well, a head of catering from a university couldn't be a head of catering from a hospital because it's different. When actually
it's catering, isn't it?
Yeah, when they were looking at it as recruiters, they were going, actually the skill set's exactly the same, the skills are exactly the same, and if we mixed up some experience from different environments, that might actually be a really healthy thing, that mixing pot of talent. We know how hard it is sometimes to even look outside of sector externally, never mind internally, where you've got perception of what people do. So one of the things that really came, and what they were able to do, was collect data of people who made those moves and demonstrate actually when people were moving from discipline every few years, everything like the motivation and the will to excitement about a new role and all that kind of thing, showed they were more successful. So I see that, having had that conversation with Ari, I've not seen I was hoping that was going to be the launch pad of other people doing more of this. I haven't seen too much of it. I always remember that in terms of that being the barriers.
And in terms of that success, what would you or Ari say were the benefits to Sodexo? What did they get out of it in terms of better outcomes?
Well, I think the first thing is, if we look at it from a hiring point of view, you're going to be much more likely to get an answer to your messaging and your outreach, right? If we go right just to the bottom, the first stage of hiring, if you're reaching out to internal talent, you're more likely to get a consideration or a response. It's a much easier process once you take the politics out of that. I think what gets in the way in traditional organisations is the politics. The discussions about possible jobs are done by secretly having a coffee or a beer or getting someone to apply. So that was one of them. Another one from a candidate point of view that was really important was removing the fear of applying, because there's still this fear, even though it's an internal job. If it's internal, I'm even more likely to be found out than if it's an external job. And if I don't get this job, which for most jobs I'm more likely not to get than get, purely on the applicant data, what does that mean? Does that then mean I'm getting mothballed and I'm looked at that I'm moving around? So I think removing those politics were important. But once they did that, they were able to have very open discussions. They're also then able to forward plan. So once you get people talking about moving and thinking about moving, you can start looking at when you're talking about the amber people, the people who are kind of going, I'm ready for something new. I'm maybe my role isn't challenging me quite so much now because I've had the 2 years of mastery of getting it done, or I'm ready for another project, or it's not quite what it was, or even just sometimes my relationship with my manager isn't great, but my relationship with another manager could be great. All the kind of reasons why people move around. So there's the obvious thing of retention, but more importantly, I think, was the fact that if you know the talent you're hiring, the risk factor is much lower. Right? I think that was one of the basic fundamentals.
I mean,
they turn up every day. You've got a much better idea of what they are, what their progression. You've got things like their performance management data you can look at, all that kind of stuff.
I've no reason to doubt that's still the case, but over in the States, I think Wharton did a study a few years ago on this, and said, internal hires routinely outperform external ones for precisely that reason. Yeah,
and they don't have the feeling in period. They do have the feeling in period into a new job when we're talking about onboarding. There's new skills and some new people and a new team and probably some slightly different ways of doing things, but there's not the into the company and the company culture and that kind of stuff. That's already pre-established. There's no surprises there.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, at the macro level, if you've got your organisation correct, you need to know what skills and people you need to have in what place to form the outcomes or the strategy of the organisation. That's why talent acquisition and organisational strategy in mature organisations should be inextricably connected. But what happens is the talent pools are seen as separate. You've got your external talent pool and your internal talent pool. And actually, it's a talent pool. And maybe in some organisations you could have an internal pool first. So the availability of an active vacancy or a role, it has a 10-day start or a 5-day start or whatever to internal applicants.
Yeah, that used to be a more prevalent in kind of a unionised when unions were a thing, when they were allowed.
And the positions were posted on notice boards.
Or workers' cooperatives that we look internally for 20 days and then you go externally. And I can certainly remember early days of being told this role is going to, as an agency recruiter, being told this role is going to come up in 10 days, but we've got to keep it internal for 10 days, but we know we're not going to get anyone. I can remember having those conversations fairly often. But I think that that idea of actually the internal talent pool and looking there first, one of the things I've always built into technology stacks with organizations, we match to internal data first, and usually that data is in somewhere like the human resource system. It's usually somewhere else. It's not normally in the ATS. The ATS doesn't normally have employees in there, or the CRM doesn't for traditional matching. And we've worked to move that data out of the HRIS and access the HRIS via the CRM so that we can actually look at, we match jobs first, and that the first match is always internal, second match is alumni, before we even begin to say, let's cast the net to people we don't know.
Yeah. And it's often the case that HRIS is a woefully out of date anyway, and incapable of doing that kind of matching. Yeah. And one of the challenges in companies that don't do internal mobility well is that the recruiters who are tasked with filling roles don't have access to the internal skill sets that individuals have. But there's also, you talked about, I think you and I have spoken around permission culture as well. There's sometimes a residence or policy or procedure that's so tight that somebody that feels that they're being almost disloyal to their existing manager by applying for a role working for somebody else in the same organization, which is a role that the organization needs somebody to do.
Yeah, but then you very much get tribes within organizations, like this is the marketing department, this is the recruiting team, this is the, and very difficult to move between the two, or very difficult to move perhaps to a different discipline. I think that's maybe how people have changed, and organizations are needing to catch up, that people might move from what externally looks like very different disciplines. Skill sets may be similar, but very different. You know, these tours of duty, I've heard people talking about tours of duty in organizations where, you know, the average length of service with a company anyway is 2.3 years, right? So you can safely say if it's 2.3 years, it's probably something like 12 months when you're first thinking about moving, 18 months when you start doing something about it.
Yeah.
However it works out, like 2.3 years or 27 months when you've actually finally gone somewhere else. But if we're talking about that happening, there's an opportunity to plug into that. I think Neil Morrison heard speak once in one of those light bulb moments that stuck with me, and he said that his view of HR now was he viewed everyone as being temporary, and his job from an HR perspective was to make sure we gave everyone the opportunity to give their optimum performance in a short-term role.
Yeah, I think you got
right, and so I think when you imply that from an internal mobility point of view, and say, right, we were expecting people to want to move. Now, at the same time, you don't want to put barriers in the way who don't want to move around, because there are those who don't want to move, and so you need to look at roles.
But it's often, it has to be sort of embedded in the culture and the communication, because, you know, I'll go back to something we spoke about earlier. So one of the barriers are typically a line manager who doesn't want to lose his or her person, top performer or whatever, who will say, you know, I've spent the last 12 months developing this person who's excellent, and what have I got for that? They're going to go. To which the simple answer is, well, it's a damn sight better than not developing them, and they stay. So, you know.
Yeah, I also think that point, we've attached mobility scores to managers and made organisations. That's worked very well, where if you become known almost as a department that does develop people and does move people on, the better talent is going to gravitate.
And a manager that does that, and people often want to work for individual people as well as exciting projects. So, and that has a benefit. You know, as that blossoms, that actually has an external benefit as well. So, you know, from an external perspective, potential employees see people moving on across doing different things, and you know, an opportunity.
The organisation is not standing in their way of doing that. This manager doesn't stand in your way of doing that. They don't treat it as a negative.
Yeah.
I also think from that point of view, it means you can plan ahead a lot further. So you have an idea that you're going to need to replace someone. Because one of your top performers is blossoming, so they're probably going to be moving on in the organisation. You need to be thinking about what roles you need to fill. Doing all these kind of things. I think we talked, when we talked on this topic a few days ago, one of the things you said that really stuck out to me is, you know, there's lots of people who you don't want to be hanging around who do, because they don't have this vehicle to go and get motivated by something else.
Yeah.
And as a result, if the motivation is 50%, the output is going to be 50% or lower.
Exactly. You know, the two are inextricably linked. You know, what you talked about, I think you alluded to, or you didn't allude to, you talked about, you know, experience. So the experience of somebody who's applied for a role internally and it's not been accepted for that role. You know, is that something that can actually decrease engagement rather than increase it? Well, it is if it's handled badly, but there are sort of ways and means of how.
Yeah, you know, I think candidate experience is candidate experience, first of all.
Exactly.
It's candidate experience. So all of the things which we would apply to external candidate experience, if we were looking at something like the candies, are multiplied when you look at it internally.
Yeah.
You know, you expect your own company to treat you slightly differently. If you apply for a job and you go into a black hole, or the progress is slow, and candidates, whoever they are, this is, you know, real candidate experience 101. There's certain expectations that they have in a recruiting process, and if we look at it externally, first of all, the expectation is that they're going to get a fair crack of the whip. They don't expect to get the job, right? They don't expect the job seeking process to be easy, and in many ways, they don't want it to be easy.
They don't want it to be easy, exactly.
Yeah, you know, they view it as it is a bit of a competition. There are people vying for the same opportunity, so they're not demanding to be successful immediately, but they want to feel that they were given every opportunity to do their best in that process. And there's loads of things we get externally, like where we have things like, I think about 50% have a group interview, but only 5% of the people are told they're going to have a group interview. So there's loads of things that happen in that recruiting process, or a test or an assessment that you weren't given proper preparation for, or given short notice to do something, or whatever it is, where you feel the system in some way prevented you from being. It wasn't about, is Paul Maxin better than Bill Boorman in this interview situation one-on-one? It was about, I couldn't really show the best Paul Maxin because X, Y, Z. So, you know, and I think we have a lot of work to do with that in all of our hiring processes, that really we need to challenge that, particularly the way we set people up for interviews and assessments and so on. But then you take that internally, if you have that feeling of, I could have got that job, but I didn't really get the opportunity, that sense of bitterness or disappointment is going to fester. You know, that's going to be like a cancer. That's going to eat away at how you feel about the company, how you feel about the process. So how you're dealt with, and how we go through that rejection process of you not being successful, and positioning it as, you know, proper feedback.
Yeah.
Having a proper feedback meeting to say, okay, this is what went on, and also leaving you with a feeling of there is another opportunity. We used to have a saying when I worked with Hard Rock that I loved, that used to be written over all the talent acquisition leaders' desks, all the managers' desks, store managers' desks, which is, you're not right, you're just not right now. So I think back to that bit in internal mobility, when we talk about other things that can go in, like mentoring and career planning and other aspects.
Well, absolutely. You turn that not successful conversation into a career development conversation.
Yeah.
And that's a wholly different sort of lens to deal with that, and a wholly.
I think also being crystal clear and honest, right? Which is what all candidates are. Being crystal clear and honest is, this is the reason you weren't.
Years ago,
this is what was missing.
That a head of recruitment, recruitment at whatever level, is really a head of rejection, because it's actually how you manage the rejection.
And I heard this conversation,
reputational risk,
on Facebook in a group, as a new conversation actually this week.
Really?
And rejection thing. And I can remember, I think James May's running track at True London about this like 9 years ago. True London, and saying, you know, and he was a recruiter in those days before Mind the Product. He was talking about, you know, really my job involves rejecting people.
Yeah. And doing that well.
Occasionally someone gets the job, you know. that's the data reality.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and, you know, as it's a fireside chat, and it's a little bit unstructured, but hopefully some, you know, I'm enjoying it anyway. You talked about setting mobility scores for managers, and I think that's another that touches on something as to why internal mobility also doesn't work, or in some organisations, is because there are no goals or targets or key performance indicators for it, as there more often than not are for external recruitment. So that is a key one, as you mentioned, but you know, there's an opportunity to have a range of goals or objectives for internal mobility that make it an integral part of your talent acquisition strategy. And it's not just the recruiters, so their organisational goals as well.
Now, we're having this conversation. The reason we're having this conversation is obviously Real Links are involved in looking at developing a product, and we've had the product discussion about internal mobility on a base level, and that's really where we had the chat and then said, you know what, we should probably broadcast this and make it wider again, because it's a super interesting context. One of the things I'm quite passionate about, I think the same as referrals around internal mobility, when we're talking about a technology to enable that, we're then talking about technology, its methodology supported by technology rather than the other way around. So yeah, it's getting that methodology right. Now, we've talked probably best part of 45 minutes about all the reasons internal mobility doesn't work. Let's just spend 5 minutes talking about the methodology and how you think, and I'll give my view on it, what I think. How do you think you can make it work?
So I'll go at the highest level, and then I'll go a bit more granular. Okay.
Yeah.
It has to be, you know, at the top level, connecting talent acquisition and organizational strategy need to be connected. Internal and external recruitment, therefore, needs to be part of your overall people plan and workforce plan. And to do it successfully, you'll need to identify, you know, successful internal mobility identifies good talent, top talent and potential, but not just them, others as well.
Now, do you think when you're talking about that workforce
trust?
Yeah, the immediate question that goes through my mind, and this is recruiting 101.
Yeah.
Are we trying to find people for jobs, or are we trying to find jobs for people?
Yeah. Well, that is a recruiting 101, and that's sometimes where a disconnect is in terms of the resource planners and the recruiters. We're actually, you know, we're actually trying to fill jobs that the organisation needs with the right people. That is the 101. And you know, we've started that the strongest talent pool available is that internal,
and the most responsive and the best known and the lowest risk level.
Exactly that. And because you know about that, and then where you know the technology can support in terms of you know, faster document understanding, you know, some semantic search, faster, you know, faster matching,
notifications,
absolutely, and that's where the technology can really help it and support it. But the process comes with the culture and the recognition. And often, you know, even though there's supports about, you know, in the American term, the C-suite or the board or the most senior leaders, you know, their biggest headache, the problem that they're trying to solve, is a talent problem in order to deliver organizational outcomes. The barriers are often at the middle level from people that don't want to lose their own people. But you know, at the board level, at the most senior levels within organizations and within companies, you know, talent is number one on their agenda, because without that talent, they're not going to fill their own targets, add the shareholder value if they're listed, or deliver the outcomes that that they're able to do. That's why internal mobility is so important.
And that's where you see internal mobility being absolutely key. So
it's key, and where I can see tech supporting that is, as we said, is through the faster understanding, matching, and much faster search, and knowing the population that's applying, and you get a lot less tissue rejection of somebody who's moving into a new role, knowing the organisation. The other side of it is also on skills assessment. We won't have time to discuss that, but you talked about it in terms of a chef at a university as opposed to being a chef at a hospital. The skills are the same. But I think it's been a great conversation. You and I are committed to some live Q&A. So hopefully our fireside chat has generated sufficient engagement from people watching or listening in to ask a few questions that we can still be fiery on in terms of our response.
Let's open up to questions. The other thing I want to point out, and I'd love to have people put it in the comments bar, or reconnect with myself and Paul or Real Links afterwards, is part of the reason. One of the things that we really want to do is actually not just talk about this, put it into some actual action. And I know that Paul and myself are looking to find 9 or 10 companies that we can build some technology with as development partners. That isn't a big pitch in terms of get a contract. It's not a contract thing. It's really understanding and developing the methodology and testing some of this stuff to say this is what we think will work and what will it. So equally, anyone out there who is interested in having another conversation with myself or with Paul directly, and then ultimately with Real Links, then ping us a message or put something in comments so we can get back to you and talk to you about that.
Yeah, please do that.
But questions, let's see what you got to say.
See what we got. Okay, thanks. It's been a great chat, Bill, and I look forward to the questions. And I'm just going to put my hat on so I can hat tip you as well.
I'll see you in the Q&A channel.
See you in the Q&A, mate. Cheers.